to present here. I always love presenting stuff to the lab and getting your really cool and interesting feedback and ideas. And please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I really like this project, and despite it already being under review, I'm always happy to hear other people's perspective on it, because I think it really does touch on a lot of issues, specifically obviously to misinformation, but also generally to methodology, which I'll get to in a second. Yeah, so this is just one part of my PhD. I have a few different projects. Okay, so let's get started. Generally, I don't need to tell you, we're in the post-truth era. We're surrounded by an overwhelming amount of information, which can be both true and false. Also, I'll say that I can't see like the chat or something, so if you do have a question, just unmute yourself. So within this overwhelming amount of information, we have biases that kind of direct our attention and influence the way we even process this information. And this can result in a fracturing of the objective shared reality. Now, the idea of a shared reality has already been discussed, and it actually has a very nice definition already by Higgins and Echterhoff and that research group. And it's defined as the experience of having inner states about the world in common with others. And there are very specific criteria that need to exist in order to have this shared reality. The first one is to have shared inner states about a specific target reference. You need to have an epistemic and an interpersonal motivation to share your inner states about a specific target, and you need to have this subjective sense of sharing. Now, if you think of these criteria, and if you think of the backdrop of the post-truth era and everything that you already know, we realize that essentially they're talking about a subjective shared reality, right? People within a certain group agreeing about their shared sentiment about a certain target. It's all very inward facing. And this raises the question, what about an objective reality? What about the actual facts that happened in the world that we might not necessarily share? And I think Terry Pratchett put it nicer than me. He says in one of his books, let's suppose that you went out here and crawled around the palace. One of the guards would probably see you and he'd think you were a thief and he'd fire his crossbow. I mean, in his reality, you would be a thief. It wouldn't actually be true, but you'd be just as dead as if it were. Belief is powerful stuff. So in thinking about how our biases direct our information processing processes within this overwhelming amount of information, and how these biases kind of turn us into individual truths, right? My personal truth, we can see how the result is a negative implication in the real world. And we can think of people storming the Capitol, right? That had a very strong subjective sense of agreement that had nothing to do with the actual reality in the world. People that oppose the COVID-19 vaccine because they personally don't want to take the vaccine, but that doesn't make the vaccine any less effective. So taking all of this together in my PhD, I think of the question of discernment of truths from falsehoods. But discernment is a really difficult task, not to mention that it's prone to biases, as I've mentioned. So we wanted to start even more basic. We want to start it in a more well-known effect relating to misinformation, and I'm obviously talking about the continued influence effect. According to it, retracted misinformation continues to influence inferences and judgments, even when it's known to be false. And this is true across different domains, like subject topics, even when participants are instructed in advance to disregard the misinformation, across different types of corrections, with or without cognitive load, and across different modalities. So if we have this very strong basic effect that shows that people don't need, essentially in this context, to decide what's true or false, we give it to them, right? I want to ask the question, could the extent of the continued influence effect be affected by how it is measured? So these are already a few jumps, so I'm just going to go over it again. We have the effect of the continued influence effect that shows that people are unable to overcome information even when they know it's false. And we know that these difficulties in discernment between truths and falsehoods have negative implications in the real world. But within the context of the continued influence effect, we first want to see, what are we even measuring? How are we even measuring the extent of to which people are influenced by misinformation? And this has actually turned out to be a very interesting detour into measurement. And we know that measurement methods prime and limit our responses. So if I ask you, how do you feel about coffee? And I give you this little text box, I'll get completely different responses, or at least very different, from a response that has to fit in this big block of text. Not to mention different contexts that are primed, right? What specific coffee are you thinking about? Are you thinking of a coffee that you're having when it's really nice outside with friends, or when you're stuck at home? I can also vary responses, not only by open text, but also giving different points on a scale, with or without increments, being continuous or being categorical. We also know that response options reflect expectations and can kind of set a norm. So if I'm asking, how many cups of coffee do you drink? And these are the options. It's pretty early here, and I probably already would not have an appropriate option reflecting my responses compared to these options that probably make me feel a little bit better. And I can also add a normative description. How do you feel about coffee? It's bad. I'm neutral. It's good. I can add different variants to sentiment about coffee. And this is all good and well, so long as we actually do have an opinion to report, if we actually do have opinions about coffee. But what if we don't have an opinion to report? What if I ask you, how do you feel about Ava Solo on a scale of 1 to 4? Very weird question. But adding an additional option so that now the scale has a midpoint kind of resolves some of that conflict. We kind of have an intuition what to respond. And I'll just say that an Eva Solo is like a reusable filter for coffee. So don't worry about that. It's a real thing. And this feeling of adding the midpoint has also been researched. And we see that the midpoint of the scale can reflect a very varying sentiments, either uncertainty, being undecided, ambivalence, or just being neutral. But it also provides an anchor and a way of satisficing. So when we only had those 4 points on the scale, it was a weird kind of where do I belong feeling, and the midpoint is a good place in the middle. But also research is concerned that adding the midpoint or including a midpoint in your scale can allow, but maybe even encourage, avoidant responding. If I don't really want to think about it too much, then I can just choose the midpoint and kind of leave it at that. But crucially, the midpoint of the scale, despite all of these alternative or additional sentiments it can express, is still interpreted as a numeric value on a scale. We still take that 1 through 5 scale, calculate means for it. So another option that literature suggests is simply to add an explicit I don't know option instead of relying on participants' individual interpretations. And the big benefit of the I don't know response is that it's explicit, but it is also usually excluded from surveys and analyses because, again, it is thought to allow for avoidant responding. But in fact, it can prevent sporadic or partial responses. So if I do not have an opinion or I do not have a response, I don't need to satisfy. I don't need to select something at semi-random. I can just say, I don't know, which means that for the rest of the results, they're going to be more certain, which will increase data quality. So taking all of that together, we apply it to the continued influence effect paradigm. So in continued influence effect paradigms, we have 2 conditions, a baseline with no specific instructions and a correction condition, which I'll go into in a second. Each condition has one of 2 versions, either lenient or severe. I'll explain again the content in a second, but you can see that it's already a 2 by 2. And we then have inference questions, again, measuring how people are influenced by the information given to them according to the version, according to the condition. So what does the paradigm actually look like? We took the classic Gilbert paradigm and adapted it so that it would describe a car crash. And in the baseline condition, participants simply read a story and have to later report. So the story goes like this. So the story goes something like this. Our correspondent reports a car accident occurred last Thursday in a central junction in the city. Traffic cameras reported a light-colored car. And then we have the version come in with statements that either describe the situation as more lenient or severe towards the driver. So the accident occurred on a day with good visibility, or in the other condition, the accident occurred on a day with poor visibility, which again changes how guilty the driver is, right? If it was a day with good visibility, why did the accident happen? Another statement that the pedestrian was they either had the right of way or that they jumped into the road, again, making the driver more or less guilty according to the version, and some more kind of neutral general statements about the accident. In the correction condition, participants received this exact warning in advance before they even started reading any of the statements. Turns out that 2 accidents happened during the same day. The statements marked in red are mistakenly taken from a report about another accident and are not about the accident you're being asked to refer to. So all of the participants in the correction condition saw this right up front. They then received the same set of stimuli, but this time the evocative statements that describe the role of the driver in the accident were highlighted in red, which is the cue for omission, right? They're from the other report of the accident. So this time, the information that the accident occurred on a day with good or poor visibility and what the pedestrian did were highlighted in red. And this is not the entire stimuli. There are a few more sentences, but just so that you get the gist. So and then the follow-up questions, the impression formation questions were, is the driver guilty? Will they be involved in another car accident? How dangerous is the driver? And overall, what is your opinion of the driver? And then some demographic questions. Now, basic reading comprehension would have us hypothesize that in the baseline condition, the driver in the severe condition, right? It was a good day. The pedestrian had the right of way. He would be judged more negatively than in the lenient condition, right? It's a good day. Why did the accident occur? But the continued influence effect is shown by the fact that the same pattern exists even in the correction condition. So people are unable to overcome the omission instructions and instead still judge the driver in the correction condition more severely than in the lenient condition, again, despite everyone receiving the same omission instructions up front. So when we think of the information that's available for participants in the correction condition, if they correctly omit the evocative statements that they were supposed to ignore in red, if they are up for the task, they do it as we requested, what information do they have in forming an opinion about the driver? What can they rely on when they're answering the impression formation questions? And this brings us to the question, could the extent of the continued influence effect be affected by how it is measured, by the literal response options that we're giving to our participants? And the paradigm as I presented it so far is, like I said, just a classic adaptation of existing paradigms. So far, we didn't make any changes to the design, so the inference questions, etc. So in the first study, we had students, and they responded to the impression formation questions. For example, to what extent is the driver guilty on a 1 through 7 scale? But crucially, we labeled the midpoint for I don't know. Thinking again, what can people say if they correctly omit the information in red? And when we look at the mean results of the impressions of the driver, we see that in the baseline condition, the driver is judged more negatively in the severe version than in the lenient. And we also see the same effect, although smaller, for the correction condition, indicating that we have evidence for the continued influence effect, replicating everything that happened so far in the literature. We also examined the frequency of selecting the midpoint, which in this case was labeled I don't know, at least once out of the 4 impression formation questions. And we see that in the baseline condition, we have about 25% of participants that selected the midpoint at least once, but that 24 goes up to 75% in the correction condition, with participants saying at least once, either the midpoint or I don't know. So to conclude the first study, we see that there's no overuse of the midpoint in the baseline condition, 25% of our participants. But we also do see a frequent selection of the midpoint in the correction condition, perhaps in response to our omission instructions, perhaps to express uncertainty. We also see that a continued influence effect when calculating the mean scores. But if we think of the mean score that I showed earlier, we now know that 75% of participants selected the midpoint at least once. So maybe that could explain why the correction condition why the versions were so similar in the correction condition. And this raises the question, what happens when we separate the midpoint and the I don't know, because they were combined in this study? And we hypothesized that not only will we replicate the findings from the first study with participants using the I don't know response more frequently in the correction condition, we also hypothesized that without the I don't know response, participants will select the midpoint more, as we've just seen. And again, we hypothesized that we will still find the continued influence effect as in previous literature. So this is not about tearing down the continued influence effect, but rather really understanding what's exactly going on there. So in studies 2, 3, and 4 with students and then online, half of the participants received 1 through 7 scale responses, and the other half received the additional I don't know response, resulting in a 2 by 2 by 2 design for the next 3 studies. Now I'm just going to go over not all the results from all studies. Okay, so when we examine the conditions that did not have the option to say I don't know, in the baseline condition, we again see a significant difference, which is not surprising, and we still find a similar, although still smaller, difference in the correction condition, indicating that we have evidence for the continued influence effect. Now, when examining the frequency of selecting the midpoint, in the baseline condition, we see again a similar 20-ish percent, and that 20% in the correction condition goes up again to a similar 60-ish percent. And these are participants that did not have the option to say that they don't know. Now, comparing that to participants that did have the option, we see about 8% of participants that selected I don't know in the baseline, compared to about 21 that selected the midpoint response. And 8% turns into 38% participants selecting the I don't know in the correction condition, while the selection of the midpoint remains fairly similar. And if we compare the frequency of selecting I don't know and the midpoint only to the frequency of selecting the midpoint when the I don't know response is not available, we see that they sum up really, really closely, indicating or hinting that without that the I don't know response expresses something that otherwise is kind of thrown into the midpoint responses. So we see that participants use the I don't know response in the correction conditions, and we see that this is a unique response to our omission instructions. So we wanted to ask, are participants aware of their lack of information? Why are they selecting the I don't know response? Why are they selecting the midpoint? Because as I said previously, the midpoint has different interpretations. So which one is it? So to that end, in the last study, we added a question to the impression formation questions. So we had our 4 basic questions. Is the driver guilty? Will they be involved in another accident? How dangerous is the driver? And what is your overall opinion of the driver? Which again are based on existing continued influence inference questions to kind of see a more kind of whole impression of the target. And after the first question, we just asked them, why did you choose this rating? And we gave them a few options based on, we also had open-ended questions. So we coded the themes in the open-ended questions, as well as based on existing literature from, I don't know, and midpoint survey research. And we gave them a few options. So we gave them the first 2 options: the driver is to blame, the pedestrian is to blame, reflecting the baseline conditions. They were also able to select that conflicting information was presented, representing maybe an ambivalence or uncertainty. They were also able to say that there isn't enough information, again, reflecting one of these I don't know or midpoint sentiments, And we also gave them the option to say, I don't want to think about it too much, which tries to address the issue of expressive responding, right? This feeling that if you just give people the option to say that they don't know, they'll kind of dismiss the rest of the survey, select I don't know, and kind of ruin the data. And again, these two options are the crucial options. So when participants do not have the option to say that they don't know, we see that both in the baseline condition, participants are pretty certain in their responses, with the vast majority saying that either the driver is to blame or that the pedestrian is to blame. Again, they're in the baseline condition. In the correction condition, we see an increase in selecting the option that conflicting information was presented, as well as that there wasn't enough information. And interestingly, in the baseline condition, there's that 1.1% on the bottom that say that they don't want to think about it too much. That represents 2 participants out of a sample of about 800. So we can kind of lay that concern to rest. So in the correction condition, we see that participants explicitly indicate that they had not enough information or conflicting information as the main motivation for their response in the first impression question. And of these participants, 64% went on to select the midpoint. Okay, or selected the midpoint in the first question, and these are the explanations that they provided. Now, when they do have the option to say that they don't know, we find no real difference from the baseline condition, which makes sense because, again, participants in the baseline condition, there's no ambiguity. But interestingly, we don't find a difference also in the correction condition, indicating that it is not the mere addition of the option to say I don't know that changes something about how people process the information that was provided to them about the driver. That's one thing. And the second thing is that we see that it's the same and almost identical percentages of people indicating awareness of the fact that they don't have enough information, that conflicting information was presented to them. And now, just to be very, very clear, the 34% of participants that indicated that the driver is to blame and the 8% of participants that say that the pedestrian is to blame are still wrong. That's still evidence for the continued influence effect because all of these participants are in the correction condition. And more than that, I'll say that we excluded participants that did not explicitly remember the omission instructions. So we asked them after they completed the questions, we asked them what were the instructions that were given to you in red. And participants who didn't know to say that they were supposed to disregard those statements were excluded from the study. So within a population or within a sample of participants that know that they have to omit these statements, some of them still indicate a reliance on misinformation, tried and true. So to conclude, I see that I've been very, very brief, but that's good because that leaves a lot of time for discussion. We see that participants are aware that they don't have enough information. And more crucially, we see that they don't misuse response options. So that selection of the I don't know response as well as the midpoint are in response to the omission instruction and not, And participants will express the state of their knowledge given their, regardless of the available response options. So they know that they don't have information, and they then turn to whatever available response options they have. But we still rely on mean calculations. So we have these participants that know that they don't know. They express the state of their knowledge to the best they can, and then we kind of misinterpret it, or something there goes astray, and we still find evidence for the continued influence effect, again, even when examining participants' responses beyond the selection of the midpoint or the I don't know. So I do want to mention some limitations which are relevant to the broader kind of implications of the continued influence effect. So one main question is, what do participants actually know? So all we've been able to point out in this study is that participants know that they don't know. They know that they should not rely on the statements in red. they know that they don't have enough information. But if we think of a real world scenario in which it's not this detached, neutral design, people still need to fill that informational void somehow. And that's where a lot of the biases that I've mentioned at the beginning can come in. So we still don't know what participants actually know. If they actually had to make a decision at the end of the task, what would that be? What information would they rely on? How aware would they be that they rely on external cues, etc.? Also, I think this is true to all continued influence effect paradigms that I've seen, at least. I find that there's a very strong negativity bias. So all of the events described are robberies and, these very emotionally evocative scenarios. And I'll say specifically in the car crash, we wanted to make it less negative, so we chose a car crash or a car accident. But even within the car accident, in the open-ended questions, we saw participants saying that, if you get behind the wheel, you're responsible for whatever happens. So no matter kind of how much we try to control participants' impression of the driver, there still is this inherent negativity that results from the mere situation, which raises the question, how can we test for the continued influence effect in other contexts, and also in real world continued, or like in other contexts of continued influence that use headlines, etc. A lot of times those initial headlines are still very evocative and very kind of emotionally strong. So again, this raises the question of how easy or how could people even overcome it. And the last thing I want to bring up is the question of what would a true control be? So if we think of all these previous, if we think of participants correctly omitting the misinformation on one condition, right? If we want to, like, what would be the condition in which both versions are truly equal? And that goes obviously not only to what knowledge participants actually have and can reliably report on, but also the content of the scenario, which goes back to the negativity bias. So trying really to think what would be a true middle ground. Would it be adopting or endorsing one type of information over another, indicating maybe a correction, but then there's a lot of literature indicating that, for example, how elaborate the correction is influences how people will adopt it, etc. So that's kind of a question that I'd love to hear what you have experienced from your own research. And in future research, we suggest not only to revisit, but also report on midpoint frequency selection. So in writing this project up, I was looking at existing continued influence research, and I couldn't really find people reporting the frequency of selection of specific responses, which makes sense, unless we're talking about a midpoint response, which again has all of these additional sentiment added to it. Also, another interesting thing to think about is a lack of knowledge versus confidence. So for example, if I know that I don't know, or maybe selecting the I don't know or the midpoint response could be just an expression of not being certain in what happened or not being very confident in my response. So maybe there's like even more in-depth understanding that we can get from dividing these two dimensions. As I said, there's this idea of using not a neutral context. So again, the idea of a car crash as being very distant, but the continued influence effect probably mostly, or at least is very meaningful in contexts that are emotionally charged. So people actually have a hard time overcoming information when it is congruent with or overcoming misinformation, when the initial misinformation is congruent with existing beliefs and it requires much stronger and more elaborate corrections, etc. But none of these questions have been examined in the context of the I don't know option. So maybe participants would use the I don't know option when they want to kind of avoid admitting that the misinformation that is congruent with them is actually false. Or maybe they'll use it as a way to opt out, going back to the original suggested literature about the meaning of the I don't know option. And then another interesting question that we want to explore is what are some of the related traits? So what can allow or encourage people to say that they don't know within this specific context of the continued influence effect, but also within the broader context of misinformation correction, discernment, et cetera. And I have some work about that. But crucially here, for example, existing intellectual humility questionnaires are more reflective. So I am open to changing my own opinions, which is not really appropriate for this specific type of task. So maybe there are other traits that are kind of in the domain of humility or something like that, that can allow for an expression or awareness of a lack of knowledge. So just to conclude, I'll leave you with the thought that the paradigms and measurements we use bias our understanding of the phenomena we're researching, and that providing relevant response options which allow expressing the state of participants' knowledge is crucial in improving our understanding of the continued influence effect. And I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'll be more than happy to take your questions and continue discussing this, because I really, really love this project. It's very cool, in my opinion. Yeah, so thank you very much.